Harold Whitman had spent his entire life believing in the values of hard work, discipline, and honesty. He had served his country with pride, endured the hardships of war, and returned home to a quiet, humble life, one that was structured, peaceful, and predictable. At 73 years old, his days were spent in a modest house in a small town where the world moved a little slower and the people still greeted one another by name. He lived on his military pension and Social Security, careful with every dollar, making sure his bills were paid on time, and ensuring that there was always enough left over for small joys, a cup of coffee at the local diner, a few dollars toward his grandson's birthday gift, and the occasional treat for his old Labrador Duke. It wasn't a lavish life, but it was an honest one, built on decades of sacrifice. But peace, as Harold was about to learn, could be taken away with nothing more than a single envelope. That morning, Harold had followed his usual routine, waking up before sunrise, brewing a pot of coffee, and settling into his recliner to listen to the radio. He liked the familiar hum of country music in the background, a quiet reminder of simpler times. When Duke barked at the front door, Harold knew it was time to grab the mail, a mundane but necessary part of the day. The usual mix of utility bills, advertisements, and Veterans Organization newsletters greeted him, but tucked between them was a thin, official-looking envelope that immediately caught his attention. His hands, rough from decades of hard work, hesitated for just a moment before he opened it. The bold black letters at the top of the page made his stomach drop. Internal Revenue Service, Notice of Refund Seizure. The words blurred for a second as Harold tried to process them. Seizure? Refund? He hadn't even filed his taxes late, let alone done anything to warrant a seizure. He adjusted his glasses, scanning the rest of the letter, his chest tightening with each line. Dear Mr. Whitman, this is a notice of refund seizure under federal statute. Your 2024 tax refund has been withheld due to an outstanding overpayment from the year 2012. This balance, adjusted for penalties and interest, now totals $4,312. Failure to comply may result in further legal action. Harold's hands trembled slightly as he turned the letter over, as if there would be some mistake, some part where it clarified that this wasn't meant for him. 2012? Overpayment? He thought back, trying to remember anything about that year that could explain this. But nothing stood out. That had been over a decade ago, and in all that time, no one had ever contacted him about any issue with his taxes. Why now? Why after all these years? His eyes dropped to the signature at the bottom of the page. Karen Sullivan, Senior Agent, IRS Collections Division. It felt cold. Impersonal, like a judge passing down a sentence without ever seeing the person on trial. Harold let out a slow breath, steadying himself. This had to be a mistake. A clerical error, maybe. Something that could be sorted out with a phone call. He'd spent his whole life following the rules, paying his taxes, and doing what was expected of him. There was no way that he owed the government money. If there was one thing he understood from his years in service, it was accountability. And this wasn't accountability. It was theft. He reached for his phone, dialing the number provided at the bottom of the letter. His first mistake was expecting a human to answer. For payment inquiries, press 1. For refund questions, press 2. To speak with an agent, press 0. He pressed 0. Please hold. Your estimated wait time is 2 hours and 38 minutes. Harold's jaw tightened as the automated voice droned on about high call volumes and suggested using the IRS website instead. He didn't even own a computer. Why would he? He had no use for one. He had always believed in handling things face to face and speaking to real people. But the world had changed. Now everything was a maze of bureaucracy, a fortress designed to keep people like him from ever reaching a real person. He let out a frustrated breath and hung up. Fine. If they wanted to make this difficult, he'd do it the old-fashioned way. Tomorrow morning, he'd go to the nearest IRS office in person. He wasn't going to be ignored. But as Harold folded the letter, something gnawed at him, a quiet, uneasy thought that he couldn't shake. This wasn't just a mistake. This was something bigger. The IRS didn't go after people like him, old men who lived on fixed incomes, who had no hidden wealth, no offshore accounts, no complicated tax loopholes. But that's exactly what made this so suspicious. Why had they waited over a decade to collect this so-called debt? Why target someone who had no means to fight back? Harold had spent his life believing in fairness, in justice, in a system that, while imperfect, still protected the people who followed the rules. But that belief was about to be tested. Tomorrow, he would walk into the IRS office expecting to clear up a mistake. Instead, he was about to uncover a system that had been quietly robbing thousands of people just like him. And whether he liked it or not, he was about to go to war one last time. Harold wasn't the kind of man to let something like this slide. He had faced war, bureaucracy, and the slow erosion of time, but nothing had ever broken him. And this was just another battle. By the time the sun rose the next morning, he had already dressed in his best button-down shirt, a pair of pressed slacks, and his old army boots. It wasn't about looking formal. It was about walking into that office with the same confidence he'd carried on the battlefield, the kind that said, "I won't be ignored." He fed Duke, locked up his house, and drove 45 minutes to the nearest IRS office, a dull gray building that looked just as lifeless as the system it represented. The waiting area was exactly what he expected: rows of uncomfortable plastic chairs, a line of people clutching paperwork with tired expressions, and a front desk manned by a bored-looking receptionist typing away at a computer. He approached with measured steps, clearing his throat. "Excuse me, I need to speak with someone about this." He unfolded the letter and placed it on the counter. The receptionist barely looked up. "Take a number." Harold exhaled through his nose, took the slip of paper, and turned to find a seat. The clock on the wall ticked away the minutes: 15, 30, 45. The room was a portrait of frustration, a young mother bouncing a crying baby on her knee, an elderly man in a wheelchair adjusting his oxygen tank, a construction worker muttering into his phone about being late for work. Harold wasn't alone in this fight. After nearly 2 hours, his number was finally called. He stepped up to the desk, meeting the tired, indifferent gaze of the woman behind the glass. Her nameplate read Karen Sullivan. "Name?" she asked, not even looking up. "Harold Whitman. I'm here about my tax refund." "Social Security number?" He recited it. She typed, expression unchanged. Seconds stretched into an unbearable silence as she read his file. Then, with the kind of condescending patience reserved for children and the elderly, she said, "Sir, the IRS has already determined that your tax refund was legally withheld due to an overpayment in 2012. If you'd like to dispute it, you can submit a formal appeal, but I should warn you that these cases take 6 to 12 months to process, and there's no guarantee of a refund." Harold clenched his jaw. An overpayment that happened more than a decade ago? And you're just now collecting on it. Karen finally looked up, and for the first time, he saw something beneath the surface. Not cruelty, but indifference, the kind that came from years of following orders without question. "Sir, the IRS has the legal authority to reclaim funds at any time if an audit determines there was an error. We send notices, but most people don't read them." She shrugged. "The government isn't in the habit of giving away free money." Harold's hands gripped the counter. "Free money?" His voice was steel. "Lady, that's my money. Money I worked for. You think because I'm old, because I live on a pension, that I'll just let you take it?" Karen sighed, unimpressed. "If you'd like to escalate this, you're welcome to hire a tax attorney. but the IRS is within its rights. Have a nice day." She moved to the next file on her screen, already dismissing him. But Harold didn't move. He had seen that expression before. It was the same look bureaucrats wore when they sent soldiers into unwinnable wars, the same look politicians had when they spoke of acceptable casualties. It was the look of a system that had already decided it didn't care. He wouldn't accept that. "Who else has had their refunds taken?" he asked. Karen blinked, surprised by the question. "Excuse me? How many other veterans? How many seniors? How many people like me woke up to this same damn letter?" Karen hesitated. It was a flicker, a split second of doubt before she caught herself. "Sir, I'm not at liberty to discuss other cases." That was all Harold needed to hear. This wasn't just about him. That night, Harold sat at his kitchen table with every tax document he still had. Old W-2s, pension statements, years of receipts. He combed through them, looking for anything that could explain how he suddenly owed the government over $4,000. And then, buried in an old envelope, he found it. A refund notice from 2012, showing that he had received exactly the amount in question. But here's the problem. He hadn't asked for it. The IRS had sent him a refund he wasn't supposed to get, then let over a decade pass before deciding to take it back with interest. They had made the mistake, but he was the one paying for it. His hands shook with anger. He needed help. The next morning, he called the only man he knew who could fight a battle like this, Tom Grayson, a retired JAG officer, and his oldest friend. "Harold, what the hell kind of mess did you get yourself into now?" Tom's voice was gruff but familiar, the same as it had been when they served together. "The IRS is stealing from veterans, Tom, and I can prove it." A pause. "Then, come by my office first thing tomorrow." Harold exhaled. He had a plan, but as he hung up, his landline rang again, an unfamiliar number. He picked up, expecting another robocall. Instead, a voice he recognized came through the line. "Mr. Whitman, this is Karen Sullivan." Harold's blood ran cold. "You need to stop looking into this. You don't know what you're getting into." Harold's grip tightened around the phone, his fingers pressing against the smooth plastic receiver like it was the handle of a rifle. The voice on the other end of the line, measured but unmistakably urgent, sent a chill through his body. "You need to stop looking into this. You don't know what you're getting into." It was Karen Sullivan. For a moment, Harold didn't say anything. He just listened, the silence stretching between them like a no-man's land. There was something in her tone, something that didn't match the cold indifference she had worn at the IRS office. It wasn't the voice of a bureaucrat dismissing another frustrated taxpayer. It was the voice of someone who knew she had crossed the line and was trying to pull someone else back before it was too late. "You're telling me," Harold said slowly, his voice low and steady, "that I should just roll over and let the government rob me blind?" Karen exhaled on the other end of the line. "I'm telling you that you don't want to go down this road. You're not the first person to ask questions. The others, they didn't get very far." Harold's gut twisted, but he refused to let it show. "That a threat, Ms. Sullivan?" "It's a warning." "Well, I don't take too kindly to warnings. See, I spent a good part of my life fighting for a country that told me I was fighting for freedom. And now that I'm trying to claim my own, you want me to shut up and take the hit?" Karen was silent for a long time. Then, finally, she sighed. "Meet me tonight, 9 p.m. The old gas station off Route 6. And then the line went dead. Harold stared at the phone for a moment before placing it back in its cradle. He had spent his whole life following the rules, but now the rules were stacked against him. If he wanted justice, he was going to have to step outside the system that had failed him. Tom wasn't happy about it. "You're meeting her alone," His old friend scoffed, rubbing his temples in frustration. Do you hear yourself, Harold? This has trap written all over it. She's scared, Tom. I could hear it in her voice. She's not calling to threaten me. She's calling because she knows I'm right. And she's willing to talk. Or she's setting you up. Harold smirked. Then I guess I better make sure I'm the one walking out of there. Tom let out a slow breath, shaking his head. Just be careful. And don't go in there without a way to record whatever she says. The gas station had been shut down for years. The neon signs were faded, the windows coated in a thick layer of grime, the pumps standing like rusted sentinels in the dark. Harold pulled into the lot 5 minutes early, cutting his headlights and waiting. The night air was cool, carrying the distant hum of cicadas, the occasional passing truck roaring by on the highway. At exactly 9 p.m., a dark sedan pulled up. Karen stepped out, dressed in a plain coat, her hair pulled back in a tight bun. She looked different from the woman behind the desk at the IRS office. Less like a government official, more like someone who hadn't slept in days. You came alone, she observed. You sound surprised, Harold replied. Most people don't make it this far, she admitted. They either take the loss or they get buried in so much red tape that they give up. But you weren't supposed to keep digging. Harold took a slow step forward. So what is this exactly? A few bad accountants looking to make a little money off veterans? Or is this something bigger? Karen hesitated. She glanced over her shoulder before finally meeting his gaze. The IRS has been running a collection initiative for years, she said quietly. They call it recovery adjustments. But it's not about fixing old mistakes. It's about targeting people who won't fight back. Seniors, veterans, people living on pensions who don't have the resources to hire a lawyer. They overpay you 1 year, wait a decade, and then demand it back along with interest. They use it to fill budget gaps. Most of the time, no one even notices. Harold clenched his jaw. And you knew about this? Karen exhaled. I processed the files. I stamped the approvals. I didn't ask questions until a few years ago. That's when I saw a name I recognized. She reached into her coat and pulled out a folded document. My father was on the list. Harold's breath caught in his throat. Karen swallowed hard. He was a Vietnam vet, served 3 tours, came home to a country that didn't care. He died thinking he owed the IRS money that they never should have taken in the first place. When I found out, I started looking deeper. And Harold, it's not just you. It's thousands of people. She handed him the document. Harold unfolded it, his eyes scanning the list of names. Pages and pages of them. Names of men and women who had served their country, who had paid their taxes, who had done everything right, only to be targeted by the very government they trusted. His hands shook with anger. We can fight this, he said, his voice steel. Karen looked at him with something almost like pity. I've tried. You can expose me, expose what I know, but it won't change anything. The IRS is too big, too protected. You might win your battle, Harold, but the war? The war's already lost. Harold shook his head. Wars are only lost when you stop fighting. Karen exhaled, rubbing her temples. Look, there's one way you might be able to make a real impact. There's an internal file, one that proves the government intentionally withholds refunds from people they consider low-risk disputes. It's in the system, but it's buried. You'll need someone on the inside to pull it. Someone with clearance. Harold raised an eyebrow. And I'm guessing that someone is you? Karen hesitated. If I do this, I'll lose everything. My career, my pension, my safety. I need to know, if I go through with this, will you see it through to the end? Harold met her gaze, and without hesitation he nodded. "You have my word." She let out a slow breath. "Then I'll send you what I can. But if you don't hear from me in 24 hours, assume they got to me first." Harold didn't sleep that night. He sat in his small kitchen, the soft glow of the old overhead light casting shadows across the table, where the document Karen had given him lay spread out like a battle map. Names. Hundreds of them. Thousands. Each one belonging to a veteran, a senior citizen, a working-class American who had been blindsided by the same injustice that had landed at Harold's doorstep. But it wasn't just a list. Karen had been right. This was a playbook. A strategy designed by bureaucrats who saw people like him not as human beings, but as numbers on a ledger. Low-risk disputes. That's what they called them. People least likely to fight back. People without the means, the energy, or the resources to wage a war against the government. Well, they had picked the wrong man this time. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall and Duke's slow, rhythmic breathing by his feet. Harold stared at the papers, fingers tracing the faded ink. Somewhere in this pile was the proof he needed to blow the lid off this entire operation. But he couldn't do it alone. The phone sat inches away. He knew what he had to do. With a steady hand, he picked it up and dialed. "I was hoping you'd call." Tom's voice was calm, but there was something underneath it. A quiet urgency. "What did you find?" "A goddamn conspiracy, that's what," Harold muttered, rubbing a hand down his face. "Karen gave me a document. A list of names, people the IRS has been targeting. And there's something else. She says there's an internal file. Something that proves this isn't just incompetence, it's intentional." Tom was silent for a moment. "Then, where's the file?" "She's supposed to send it to me. If she can get it out." Another pause. Then we wait. 24 hours passed. Then 36. Then 48. Karen never sent the file. She never called. She was just, gone. Harold tried everything. He called the IRS office, but they said she was no longer employed there. He checked the news, expecting to see some vague, bureaucratic explanation about internal investigations or government misconduct. Nothing. It was as if she had never existed. A cold, creeping realization settled in Harold's gut. They had gotten to her. And now they were coming for him. It happened 2 days later. Harold had just stepped outside to grab the mail when he saw the 2 men in suits standing by his driveway. They weren't FBI, and they weren't local law enforcement. They were something else. Something quieter. More deliberate. "Mr. Whitman," one of them said, voice smooth, practiced. "We'd like to have a word." Harold didn't answer. He just folded his arms and leaned against the porch railing, Duke standing stiff beside him, a low growl humming from the back of his throat. "We understand you've been in possession of some sensitive government documents," the second man said. "We'd like to retrieve them." Harold smirked. "That's so? You boys got a warrant?" The first man smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "No need for a warrant, Mr. Whitman. We're just here to offer you some friendly advice. People who dig too deep into matters that don't concern them sometimes find themselves in difficult situations." Harold tilted his head. "That a threat? Just a warning? Like the one Karen Sullivan tried to give you?" His jaw tightened. They knew. "Now we can make this easy. Hand over the documents, and we'll forget this whole thing ever happened." Harold stared at them, his heart thudding in his chest. And then, very slowly, he turned his back to them and walked inside. He shut the door, locked it, pulled down the blinds. And then, with hands that had once been steady in battle, he picked up the envelope full of names and fed it into the scanner. He wasn't handing over anything. He was going public. The next morning, the story broke. Veteran organizations, local news stations, even a handful of independent journalists who specialized in government corruption. Harold had sent the documents to all of them. And once it was out there was no taking it back. The story spread like wildfire. IRS caught targeting veterans and the elderly. Thousands of tax refunds seized without justification. Internal memo suggests intentional discrimination against low-income citizens. And then the public outrage began. Protests, lawsuits, congressional hearings. The IRS was forced into the spotlight, scrambling for explanations for damage control. But the people weren't buying it. And then, just when Harold thought it was over, just when he thought he had one, he got the letter. It arrived the same way the first one had. Crisp, white envelope. Government seal. But when he opened it, his hand shook. It wasn't from the IRS. It was from Karen. No return address. Just a single sheet of paper. It read, "You did it, but it's not over. They'll be watching you now. Be careful." At the bottom, an address. No name, no explanation, just an address. Harold stared at it, his heart pounding. A choice lay before him. Did he leave it alone, walk away while he still could? Or did he go deeper to find out what Karen had left behind, to uncover whatever final piece of the puzzle she had risked everything to send him? He looked out the window at the quiet street, the Duke sitting faithfully at his feet, wagging his tail. For a brief moment, he thought about stopping. And then, just as quickly, he reached for his coat. The war wasn't over. Not yet.